I'm Alvin Benton, an in-house attorney at Capital One, a board member of our ACC DFW chapter. And I'd like to welcome you to our Diversity and Inclusion Series panel, Getting On and Staying on the Ship of Allyship. Before I turn it over to our esteemed moderator, Mark Melton, a partner at our sponsor firm, Holland & Knight, who will introduce you to our wonderful panelists, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping items. First, thanks to our wonderful sponsor firms, Stewart Law Group and Holland & Knight. Thanks to our technical support, Walter Harvey and his company White Rabbit, for enabling our Zoom capabilities. And last but not least, thanks to Susan Harvey, our ACC Executive Director, responsible for our timely marketing efforts and logistical support. We greatly appreciate you. I look forward to today's robust and authentic discussion on allyship and what it takes to be an effective ally. Thanks to you all for attending. And with that being said, I'll turn it over to Mark, who will lead today's discussion. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Alvin. It's not often I'm called esteemed, so I appreciate you saying that about me. That's very kind. We're happy to be here today. Holland & Knight is really excited to sponsor this type of discussion group. We definitely think this is important, and I'm personally looking forward to this discussion, hopefully learning a few things myself. So as Alvin noted, my name is Mark Melton. I'm a tax and corporate partner at Holland & Knight in Dallas. And I think the first thing that I'd like to do is let's go around the horn to our panelists and let them begin to introduce themselves. So we'll start with Amy Stewart, who is our co-sponsor for this event. So Amy, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thanks, Mr. Esteemed Mark. My name's Amy Stewart. I am the founding partner of Stewart Law Group. We are a commercial litigation firm based here in Dallas, Texas. And it's been an honor for us to work with the ACC this year and the D&I committee with trying to put together practical and informative programming like this. So we hope you enjoy it. Thanks.
All right, moving along to Mr. James Waters.
Greetings, everyone. I'm James Waters. I am the General Counsel and Corporate Secretary of Frost Bank. I am in my third year in that role, and prior to that time, I was a partner at Haynes & Boone in the finance and international practice groups, and spent nearly 18 years at that firm after having begun my practice as an associate in international finance at Sherman & Sterling in New York. Delighted to be with you here today.
All right, thank you. Lij, would you like to go next?
Sure, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lij Thomas, and I am Chief Strategy Officer of Kanarys, which is a tech startup in Dallas that is really seeking to revolutionize diversity inclusion in corporate America with data-driven insight. I also serve as the head of diversity inclusion for a public utility in Southern California, have 13 plus years in D&I experience in the Fortune 500. My roots are actually in Dallas. Really started this work building diversity and inclusion from the ground up for Southwest Airlines. So thank you for this, to all the sponsors for today's conversation, and really looking forward to engaging with my panelists in a great discussion.
Thank you very much. Now I'm getting emails from people joking about the esteemed comments. So I'm going to have to add it to my business card, Alvin. So thanks for that. Kimberly, why don't you go next? Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kimberly King-Webb. I am Chief Human Resource Officer here at Christus Health. Christus is a not-for-profit Catholic healthcare system headquartered in Irving, Texas, with hospitals throughout Texas, Louisiana, and New Mexico and South America. I've been in-house here at Christus with the responsibilities both on the HR side and employment law for some years now. But before that, I started my career with a couple of large firms, Hush Blackwell and Norton Rose Fulbright, and had the pleasure of working at both of those great places. And so I mention that because I think as we talk about some of the things on the panel today, it's made me reflect about some of my experiences at those firms. And so I'm excited to talk with the panel about that.
Well, while we've got you, Kimberly, let's just start with you. The first order of business here is to define what an ally means. So can you talk a little bit from your perspective on what is allyship and what does it mean to be an ally?
Well, it's one of those words that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, I'm sure. But for me, I think that it really is as simple as someone who is is willing to stand in solidarity with people of underrepresented groups. At its heart, I think it means being someone who, not necessarily a friend, but someone who befriends a up-and-coming associate or anyone from an underrepresented group, and championing the causes that they champion, taking their burdens on as your own, and holding other people accountable.
All right, thank you. Lij, I know that you've got some thoughts on allyship, and in this particular webinar, we've kind of focused our discussion on allyship in terms of race, but I still think it's important to recognize that it does go well beyond that. And so why don't you share your thoughts on allyship and what it means to be an ally, and feel free to expand beyond the scope if you like.
Yeah, happy to, Mark. So certainly allyship comes into play in terms of race. I often think of allyship as any institution, corporate America, law firms, nonprofits, any institution typically has an in-group and an out-group. And in-group is typically defined in terms of who's in power and who is the majority demographic, certainly in leadership. So I think of allyship as the ways in which those of us who are in the in-group or have any level of privilege, if you will, really reach out and create a safe space and a camaraderie with people who are traditionally haven't had a seat at the table or not part of the majority demographic. So by that definition, allyship is broad and includes all of us, because at one time or another, all of us have known what it is like to be to have experienced the in-group, out-group dynamics. So yeah, you're right, Mark. I believe allyship is very broad and is broadly applicable to all of us.
And Mark, this is James. I'd like to chime in as well. I've given this a lot of thought in anticipation of the discussion that we have today. And I really think allyship is the apex of relational engagement in a professional context. We talk about the importance of having a mentor, a sponsor, a champion, and the like. And those are important and indeed critical roles. I would note, though, that in each case, the actor is doing something almost exclusively for someone else. And the actor is also, in a real sense, attenuated from the object or goal of the effort. Whereas in the case of allyship, I think that obviously derives from the notion of being an ally, which really involves uniting oneself with someone else to promote or pursue some common interest. And so I think that's a key element of the notion of being an ally. What it means for us to join together to deconstruct and dismantle systems and processes and practices of injustice, inequality, or inequity in various contexts, including, obviously, for today's purposes, legal contexts.
Agreed. Amy, do you want to close out that question with any thoughts on your side?
There is no way I'm going after Mr. Waters. I'm just going to say what he said. No, seriously, from my sports background, I have a simple example that talks about allyship and goes to what Kimberly's talking about. as well. And what Liji's talking about the people that are in and the people that are out. So we would always have this, our coaches made sure that we did this when we had recruits on campus, because they're coming into an environment, they're in high school, they don't know anybody. And it's really easy as a team to start talking about school and everything else and not even thinking that we're excluding that person, because we've welcomed them to be a part of our team for the weekend, but we are just by our actions of not including them. And so to me, allyship really is about opening up your circle, acknowledging someone's outside of it, and not telling them to take over the circle, but just join in. And so that's kind of a simple analogy I have about allyship.
Thank you. You know, I circulated this among the panelists, and I'm just going to take just a few minutes, and this will probably be the most that you'll hear me talk at one time throughout this entire thing. But I want to cover just a few points that I found in my research and preparation for this on just some practical points of what it means to be an ally. The first one is be an observer. You know, just as economics and gender politics affect and influence everything we do, you have to assume that racism or any other kind of discrimination is affecting your daily life. And if you can put yourself in someone else's shoes by observing towards an end of finding some empathy, you know, that's a good first step. The second one is be a sponsor. You know, vocally support your minority colleagues, lend your credibility and influence, and share their goals with other influencers to try and push them up the ladder. The third one is be a champion, which is similar to number two, but this goes more to an advocacy role to helping them receive access to opportunities and other people of influence. Be an amplifier. Use whatever privilege or position that you have to invite other people to take on highly visible roles, give them the credit when they have a good idea to really try and elevate their status in the organization. Be a scholar, which is actually spend some time researching and reading, and whether they're blog posts or scholarly articles, just to try and understand and put yourself in the shoes of another person to figure out where they're coming from, as opposed to jumping to a conclusion based on your own life experience. The next one, which I actually first heard at the Holocaust Museum, is the word upstander, be an upstander, which is in contrast with being a bystander, where when you see wrongdoing, maybe you just stand by and do nothing, but actually being an upstander means to speak up, to lend your strength and your position to defend and move things forward in a positive way. And be a confidant and actually talk to people, figure out what their goals are in their career, what they want to accomplish, and try and find ways to help them do it. And finally, you know, be a flawed human being and do the work anyway. I think this is one of those issues that, you know, is incredibly complicated because it involves not just some mechanical or mathematical formula. It's really getting into the heads of other people and trying to understand where they're coming from. So it's something that I think all of us are going to fail at in its process as we move forward. So one of my favorite quotes is, "Don't let perfect be the enemy of good." And I think that is probably very applicable here in this context, where you're going to make some mistakes. You're going to do some things where you think you're helping and you're not. And you just got to be open to the feedback to realize maybe you didn't do exactly what you thought you were doing or in the way that you do. And before I move on, because I want to ask the panelists, you know, which of those really stood out to them and why. I want to introduce Tim Powers, real quick, who just joined us. So Tim, I'll let you introduce yourself, actually, if you'd like.
Thanks, Mark. Let me first of all apologize to you all. I had my times wrong, and Alvin, thanks for sending that note to encourage me to jump on. So I apologize for that. Tim Powers, I'm the managing partner of Haynes & Boone, and have had the great pleasure of working with James over the years, and look forward to being part of this panel with you all on this important topic.
Thank you very much. Does anybody want to go first? I mean, did any of those items stand out as important to any of you? I can call people. Kimberly, go ahead.
Well, you know, as I reflect back on some of my own experiences in my career, the one several of them stood out, but the one that stood out the most for me was sponsor. And I think James mentioned this before about the impact that a sponsor can have on a career. And I think for the first part of my career and graduating law school, it was all about you need a mentor, you need a mentor, you need a mentor. And it was some years down the road before I really understood and realized that I needed a sponsor. And unfortunately, I've been blessed to have some really key people who took on that role for me, even when I didn't quite know that they were taking on that role for me. And so I look back at opportunities that I had as a young associate to argue a brief before the Court of Appeals, or to sit second chair in a case at trial. That, to Amy's point about stopping to look to see who's in the circle and see who's not in. And I think that particularly as young associates and how law was practiced, where partners can just use any associate they wanted without a lot of accountability of making sure that people are getting equal opportunities for high profile cases or for opportunities for time to shine or to do publications and to do speeches and develop the skills that it requires to ultimately bring in business. And so I think that the intentionality of being a sponsor is so critical to young attorneys. And again, I look back at a few key people who gave me opportunities and who were willing to give me those stretch assignments and let me take the deposition, or being vocal when it came to performance reviews. I remember a first performance review where one of the criticisms was that I was too quiet. And a female partner kind of stood up and said, well, you know, let's look at that, and let's make sure that we're creating a space where our associates feel like they have a voice and that they're able to speak up. So for me, being a sponsor was really key.
Hey, Mark, I'd like to jump there as well. So Kimberly's experience is a microcosm of what happens in corporate America day in and day out. Here's what all the research says, is that women, people of color, underrepresented talent tend to be over-mentored and under-sponsored. And sponsorship really changes the rules of the game. And so when you have someone typically much more senior in an organization who has seen you play, has gotten to know your unique talents and abilities, and in those closed room circles where we're talking about who the next hot job goes to or who takes on the next, the high profile client, it's that sponsor that extends their social capital to say, I've seen Kimberly or any member of an underrepresented group. I've seen them play. I think this opportunity should go to them. And they're absolutely critical. And if you think about allyship really as a continuum, sponsorship is that active championing of somebody and the extension of your own social capital to ensure they get those opportunities and ensure that they succeed.
I think that's an interesting comment. It never occurred to me to really make a distinction between sponsorship and mentorship. But I think that's a fantastic comment.
Mark, this is James. You know, I want to pick up on that thread. I like the way Lij frames that as a continuum, and I have thought of it as the same way, with the various points on the continuum, including among others, interest, instruction, and investment. So, when someone's young and promising, any number of people are going to be interested in him or her as a potential associate, a potential colleague in some respect. And then a big part of what we do, as a partner, I recall from my years as a partner and having worked with very, very good and committed partners as well, that part of what we do is provide instruction, we provide training, we provide guidance and direction. We've got to do that because it's an important part of the compact that we have with associates, that they will be trained and prepared and so forth. And it's important because it enables them to grow and develop in ways that are good for the enterprise, the firm, or whatever the enterprise might be, and for the clients of the enterprise. So you've got interest and you've got instruction, but then investment is where the real difference can be made. And I think that's where you see the kind of allocation and deployment of personal resources. They can be political, relational, commercial, or otherwise, but when someone is willing to put her capital in whatever form it may take on the line to support and advance someone whom she's identified as a person of interest and to whom she's provided instruction, that's a meaningful differentiator that goes beyond mere mentorship, important though it is as a starting point and at a certain level, really to sponsorship and allyship in ways that enable someone to achieve what he or she can based on God-given talent and drive and ability.
So James, a follow-up on that comment. To your point that, as partners, we should be training our younger lawyers, and I assume this is still true for in-house, legal leadership as well for their younger lawyers. As you made the comment, my head immediately went to, well, of course we should be doing that for all of our associates, and I feel like a schmuck for responding that way. But my question to you is, does being an ally mean doing something above that for out-of-power groups?
I think it does. In a real sense, yes. It means being cognizant of the particular privilege and position that the person in power, the person who is the sponsor or champion or ally, enjoys, and the benefits of that position that she or he can bring to bear on behalf of someone who's not in that same cohort. It's not enough, I think, simply to help someone get positioned generally to succeed, and then to leave him or her to fend for himself or herself. As you and I discussed in one of our pre-calls, no one succeeds simply and solely by virtue of his or her own worth, merit, and effort. All of us who've enjoyed any measure of success have had any number of people who have supported us, a network, a community, a group of partners and others who believed in us and who've helped to advance us, both in spaces where we were present and notably in spaces and places where we were absent, but where advocacy on our behalf was absolutely critical.
And I agree with that statement. I've long said that hard work is only part of the equation. The system that allows you to convert hard work into success is what really matters. And I think allyship is creating part of that system, because if hard work was really the key element, there's a whole lot of people in the world that work really, really hard, way harder than I do, and still live in abject poverty. So the system is just as important as the hard work. So I think that's a great comment. Tim, I'd like to give you an opportunity real quick. I don't know if you had anything that jumped off that list, or if you want to just give some general thoughts on what it means to be an ally. I think you're still on mute, Tim.
Unmute
There
myself.
you go.
Thanks, and again, thanks again for this opportunity. You know, the idea of allyship, the idea of sponsorship and promotion is really a willingness to invest, and I think most importantly, willing in this instance, in the circumstance we're talking about, and a willingness to invest in someone that's different than you. Particularly, I think in our legal profession, it's been most easy to always look around the table and not try necessarily to enlarge it or to differentiate it, and so that willingness is something that I think each of us in the roles that we have as senior people in law firms, or as that we move up within organizations as we become more senior, have a responsibility, not just in our own organizations, but to our profession as a whole, to become an investor in the future of our profession, an investor in what the rule of law will look like in the future, and who will be part of shaping that. And all of you have said historically, and the differences that diversity brings in ideas and thoughts, and how you can collectively work together to come to a better solution, to build a better society, becomes the importance of why all of us should be willing to invest in our colleagues, and in somebody that's different than we are. It's not all one way. It is, you know, you get out of something what you put into something, and looking at that as well, the richness that you can get out of developing the relationships, the richness that you can get out of expanding the breadth and the depth of the organization that you're part of, and the service that you can bring to your clients and your communities through expanding those relationships, is very much a two-way street. It can start off with, yes, I've invested in a way that, and I've invested my social capital or political capital or otherwise to help promote someone, but it really, it really enriches your life. It really enriches the organization as a whole. But that willingness to commit to that becomes so very, very important. And it's, and I see Amy, I see, Alvin, others, Kimberly, all who've been athletes, and it's really part of being part of a team as well. And ensuring that you're, with every generation, building an organization stronger than the one you joined, and leaving it better than the one you've joined. So I guess I would just point out, it's not a one-way street, and it is just a mindset of a willingness to make the investment. And once you do that, I think not only is your organization more benefited from it, but you are, and society as a whole is.
Great. Thank you, Tim. And Amy, I think we've got some questions from the folks watching here. Do you want to read some of the questions?
Yeah, so this one's about, I think it's timely, it's about sponsorship. It's how do we go about, and we'll throw this to Lij, how do we go about finding a sponsor? And on the flip side, how do we decide who and how to sponsor?
Yeah, so I appreciate that question. Let me clarify a little bit of the distinction between a mentor and a sponsor, because I think it's important here. So a mentor is somebody you find. A mentor is somebody who someone in your organization or your environment, you admire certain traits or qualities about them, and you reach out to them and ask for a mentoring relationship. A sponsor is different. You actually don't ask for a sponsor. A sponsor is somebody who proactively reaches out, sees something in you, sees traits or characteristics, has seen you play, and makes the decision to extend their social capital and sponsor you. So the question was about how do you ask for or find a sponsor, and the reality of it is you really don't. You know, in my own experiences of sponsorship, and I've been blessed to have many sponsors in my life and in my career, or in the people that I'm sponsoring, it has to be an active. Tim talked about leaving an institution or a firm better than you found it. I see it so much as leadership legacy, and so, you know, a sponsor is. They notice people bringing their A game day in and day out. And if there's, I mean, you know, I think also if there's a commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, you're also looking for sponsoring talent that does not have a seat at the table and is underrepresented. So you don't ask for sponsorship. Sponsorship is something that somebody reaches out to you, gives you an opportunity, or says, I really want to see you develop. You're great talent for the firm, and really extends that social capital. The other thing I'll say about sponsorship is typically if it's a stretch assignment or if it's comfort and growth do not coexist. If your sponsors afforded you an opportunity that is beyond, you know, the roles or the places that you've played before. The other thing a sponsor does is provide coaching and also provide air cover when things may not go quite as you they would have envisioned. So that sponsorship, I'll go back to what Tim said, it is an investment in a person. And so, and it comes about because someone has seen you bring your A game and they're deeply committed to both their own leadership legacy and also creating a better firm than the one they entered.
Amy, did we have one more?
Yep, we have one more from Ann. Again, Lij, great insight. Can you give examples of mentoring versus sponsorship in the law practice that will help illustrate the difference to senior lawyers?
Gosh, I feel like this is a different shade of the previous question. Mm-hmm. So I'll try to not repeat myself and provide some new insights. So difference between mentorship and sponsorship, practical examples. So a mentor might be someone I go to, again, my own accord. I approach someone and say, hey, I need advice on this client. I need advice on, you know, kind of how did you arrive at managing partner of the firm, or so that's the mentor. A mentor is a relationship that is defined by someone you talk to about your career. A sponsor, on the other hand, is somebody who talks about you. So a sponsor, I'll go back to the closed door meetings, senior executives, we're talking about who gets the next hot job or opportunity or key client. That sponsor's in that room saying your name and saying this opportunity needs to go to whoever, the name of whoever their designated person is. And so that's the difference. A mentor is somebody you talk to about your career. A sponsor is someone who talks on your behalf and really advocates and champions for you.
So it sounds like if you were a band, the difference would be a consultant on the kind of music you're producing versus a promoter that's out there selling tickets to your shows.
The music analogy, Mark.
Can I just add to something that Lij said, because I completely agree with everything she said about you don't go out asking for a sponsor. But I do think that in my own experience, both my own personal experience and what I've seen with with some minority attorneys is that often, or sometimes, we're told to, work twice as hard and kind of keep your head down and just work hard and someone will notice you. And I don't think that that's always true. So I think that we have to the point about how to find a sponsor, I don't think you go out and ask for that, but I do think you have to make yourself available to building relationships with people and for people to get to know you. So as I look at one of the strongest sponsors that I've had, we bonded in that we both shared a ugly habit of going to the office on Sundays after church and catching up or trying to get ahead for the next week. And so, would go to church, go to brunch, and she would just see me in the office on Sundays. And so not a lot of people there. We would start to chit chat and developed a relationship. And by virtue of me being in the office on Sunday, I guess she thought I had some kind of work ethic. So I think that, I guess my point is just simply that you can't go out and ask for it, but you have to make yourself available. You have to have those authentic relationships, and just for people to get to know you and what your desires are, what you want your career to look like, so that they can effectively advocate on your behalf.
Hey, so Kimberly, I absolutely agree with you. The reality of the matter is you're not going to sponsor someone that you don't trust their character and their competence, but also just genuinely like them and enjoy the working relationship. So that, I often call it return on relationship. That relationship and having authentic, trusted relationships with a sponsor is absolutely critical to how sponsorship happens.
So I think those are those are great comments on, recruiting a sponsor or a mentor. I'm a little curious from the perspective of someone like me that's a white guy. Excuse me. What are our responsibilities to identify people that we should sponsor if we're looking at it from the other side of the coin?
Mark, I'll take that. I think that's a great question. And in fact, if you had not posed it, I would have actually to put a little bit of a different spin on the query that was posed. How does one find a sponsor? And as Lij noted, you can't really do that. As Kimberly noted, there's got to be a real relationship, and one has to put herself in the position of developing a relationship such that sponsorship could follow. I would say that folks like you and Tim recognize leaders in your firms, in the community, in civic spaces, and elsewhere where you have a presence, should be looking for those opportunities. And I know that's the case for Tim. I've understood that to be the case for you. I would say that both in terms of your own sponsorship, your own identification of opportunities to support and sponsor and advance the opportunities of someone who doesn't customarily have a seat at the table. You've also got the benefit of being at the table and behind closed doors and individuals of influence who could impress upon other folks at the table the importance of their stepping up and stepping forward and engaging in like conduct. In some respects, it's a matter of culture, matter of values. If you're part of institutions that value diversity, equity, and inclusion in the ways that so many law firms say they do, and in the ways that clients want to see, I think there's real opportunity to convey to colleagues, other members of the partnership in the law firm, and other members of boards and civic spaces and so forth, that there's a real need not only to do the good work on behalf of themselves and those persons whom they know from the country club, from from Y guides, from their children's prep school classes and what have you, but also to reach beyond the known and the familiar and support a broad range of talent in ways that advance that objective, the diversity, equity, and inclusion objective that is much ballyhooed and yet where there remains much work to be done.
I think that's a great comment. For my own experience, as I've thought about this and evolved over the years, and how I think about these issues, one of the things that has helped me really do an accurate self-evaluation is to look at who are the people in my social group, who are the associates that I'm working with on a regular basis, and what do they look like? Are they male or female? There's no more telling test of whether you're being intentional, as Kimberly said earlier, in selecting who you're going to sponsor or mentor, than looking at the people you're actually sponsoring and mentoring. So I would encourage people to go through that drill and actually think about who are the people that you send the work to in your organization, and do they look like you? And if they do, then maybe be a little bit more intentional about who you're choosing to work with in your organization.
Mark, if I could add something, and following up on what sort of everybody said, but particularly on Kimberly's thought, I think it's important as well that those that can be your sponsor, that they understand your ambition, and that and the trust that needs to be built, that Lij has referred to. It becomes important for anybody that can be in that sponsoring mode to understand exactly whether you want to call it bringing your A game or anything else like that, but you're bringing an idea and a vision of your career and your future, and the person who has the opportunity to sponsor for you understands that and understands why you want to do that and why you feel you would be good at that particular role, responsibility, position. Or again, it's going back to the sporting analogy. It's put me in, coach. I am ready. I want that project. In essence, give me the ball. And I think there, let's particularly say in law firms, which has been where my experience has been, there actually isn't enough of that. And I would say across the board, but particularly a reluctance on the non-white lawyers that I've experienced over to really make known really what your dreams are, what your goals are, having those discussions, because those are important. That unless you get it out there, people may not realize and may not assume. And so I would say you can't assume that that's just going to be a natural, oh my gosh, I'm sure that person is suited for this one way or the other. So I know that's not an easy thing to do, but it becomes important at some point in time that you have to make sure you're getting that point across.
Well, thanks, Tim. And before we transition to the next more controversial and therefore more interesting topic, just to summarize, I think everyone's thoughts, if I get this right, you can correct me if I'm wrong. If you're in a position of needing an ally or a sponsor or a mentor, it's certainly good practice to make yourself known, work hard, go out there and get that. I think on the other side of the coin, though, it's important for those of us that look to be allies to make sure that we are proactively doing our part and not waiting, right? It's easier when someone points themselves out to you, but I think we still have a responsibility to be proactively out there talent scouting, as opposed to, some people may passively sit and wait for someone to approach them. So our next topic, the question is, how do you think about privilege with respect to what does privilege mean, and can you truly be an ally if you don't believe privilege exists? And if you're on my Facebook page, you will know that there are people out there in 2020 that still believe privilege is not a real thing. So, and it's a spectrum of what people think privilege is. And so I'd like to get your thoughts on what you think privilege means, and how that impacts one's ability to actually be an ally. James, you want to take the lead on this one?
Sure. So I think of privilege as a set of rights, advantages, or opportunities granted to or conferred upon a person or group of persons by another group or an agency, a state, an instrumentality, or an institution, and in particular, opportunities, advantages, and so forth based on race. And can one be an ally? Can one be an effective ally without believing in the notion of privilege? I've struggled with that. I've given that significant thought. I think at the least there has to be an awareness of the power differential and either a systematized or systemic power differential that the person who's going to be a sponsor or ally enjoys, so that he or she can be authentic and effective in engaging with someone to be supportive and to understand exactly what the set or system of advantages is within which that person's trying to be supportive, trying to be an advocate, and trying to aid and advance a person of talent who's otherwise the non-privileged party. I will tell you, I've not reached a definitive conclusion on that. I'm keenly interested in the thoughts of others on this panel as to whether one can be an effective ally without being aware of privilege. I think it's a hard question, candidly.
It was intended to be so.
Well, there you have it. There you have it.
Lij, it looks like you've got something stirring over there. Did you have a comment on this?
Yeah, so lots of thoughts on this, Mark. First of all, I think of privilege very broadly. I think especially in the conversations going on today in our society and in our culture, particularly about race, I think this conversation gets shut down or people stop listening to each other, specifically around the concept of white privilege. And so how I think about that is white, and certainly in the conversations I have had with senior executives who are straight white men about privilege and white privilege. White privilege does not mean that your life has not been tough. White privilege means that one of the reasons why your life has been tough, a reason is not the color of your skin. There could be a lot of other reasons. Growing up in a socioeconomically depressed area of the country, born to a single parent, whatever the life circumstances are that have made your life difficult. Certainly what recent events in society have revealed is that, certainly for our African-American brothers and sisters, life is different, and the color of your skin can determine how you are treated in the criminal justice system. And so I want to address that head on because I think it's important. And in the conversations I've had about privilege, specifically around white privilege, just to clarify that it does not mean your life has not been difficult. I will also say that there's all kinds of privilege. So as the daughter of Indian immigrants to this country, I have privilege so I'm a heterosexual female. In most of the rooms that I am in, the dominant, the majority demographic, at least in terms of sexual orientation, are heterosexual individuals. That gives you heterosexual privilege. Again, I'm going to go back to in-group, out-group. Where are you in the majority, and what are there biases for, as someone who does diversity inclusion work full-time, the biases that I face are about surprised that I don't work in computer science, or I'm not an engineer, or those are different biases than what other people have to contend with. And there's all sorts of types of privilege. And I think particularly related to advancing an environment of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the best use of all of our privilege is to find a way to expand privilege and opportunity to people who have traditionally been left out.
Well, you mentioned the word bias several times there, which I think is a good transition, into implicit bias and kind of the subconscious notion of drawing towards an affinity group that looks like you or thinks like you. What role do you think implicit bias plays in being an ally and recognizing your implicit bias? And how do you overcome that? And more importantly, do you think is implicit bias the same as racism? And how do we parse all these ideas, especially among the white viewers who I can tell you over the years, there's been a lot of confusion over how we label these different ideas and which ones we're comfortable with and which ones we think we need to work through and that it's okay to work through and which ones are just inherently evil and bad.
Yeah. Is this question directed to me, Mark?
It could be if you'd have an answer on ready, and then we'll get some follow-ups from some others.
Sure, I'm happy to start, and certainly want to defer to my other panelists on the call as well for their thoughts. Implicit bias. Basically, here's what 50 plus years of research and certainly D&I work in corporate America has taught us, is that if you have a brain, you are biased. We are all biased. None of us are immune from bias, and so much of the next chapter of diversity, equity, and inclusion work is how do you mitigate bias in your systems, in your promotion discussions, talent planning, pay equity conversations? Because if we can figure out how you do this, then you're no longer dependent on human beings not being biased, because the reality of the matter is that we're all biased. So implicit bias, unconscious bias, by its very definition, you're not conscious really of the biases that you have. It's just autopilot for our brains, and it's a series of lifelong tapes and life experiences, tapes that play in our head of life experiences, the way we grew up, who we interacted with, the stories we were told, that is really, really tough, if not impossible, to rid ourselves of. But what we can do is be more proactive about mitigating bias. And speaking out, Mark, you mentioned being an upstander when we see bias at play.
Kimberly, did you have a comment on implicit bias and how people should think about this?
I can.
Yeah,
but I think Lij summed it up very well, and I think of it in the same way of implicit bias. Everyone has it. I think racism is implicit bias unchecked. And so when you allow your biases to affect how you behave, how you act, that you might be more inclined to think that an African-American male is dangerous, or other biases that many people have. and turn it into a behavior, an actionable behavior in how you act. And I think the other part of it is you're realizing that, yes, there is intentional racism, but there's also oppressive systems that we're all a part of, whether we like it or not. And so understanding that there are systems in place that have been in place a very, very long time in this country, and continue in many ways, and not necessarily that an individual is acting in a racist way, but that there is, pay equity issues. There's clear issues with attorneys of color being able to rise into C-suites and partnerships. And so understanding that there are systems in place that that help perpetuate those issues, I think is also important.
So it seems to me that the most important people to understand implicit bias and how it's impacting them are the people that are in the in group, whichever situation, since they wield the power to actually do something about it and to make some systemic changes to actually be an ally. Tim, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I know for me, I grew up in Oklahoma, the reddest of red states, and in a very racist, overtly racist environment. And so I feel like over the course of my life, there's been a trajectory of a lot of light bulb moments that went off where I thought, oh, that implicit bias thing actually is real. And I can validate that with my own thoughts and how I've evolved over the years. What's your experience with that, and how do you feel about it?
I grew up in a little bit of a different environment in Southern California where one thought wrongly at the time that there really wasn't any any type of racism or bias that you were dealing with at the time, and so I'm probably fit in that category that tends to be described as the white person that's the good person and therefore thinks that they can't be a racist, and I think it becomes we're in a really, really critical time in our history right now where I think we have an opportunity to open the minds in what might be a privilege 101 or racism 101, where the white feeling is, oh my gosh, don't label me as a racist because I'm a good person, so I really can't be a racist. But the understanding of the environment that you've been raised in has just, I hate to say it, naturally caused it, but has certainly perpetuated it. And it goes on around you in a way that you don't understand it until you really dig into it. And you have to be open and willing to do that, and willing to recognize that, because until you do recognize it, you can't change, and you can't break out of it to begin to look at things differently and look at things from the approach of you're calling something diversity and you're calling something inclusion because that means somebody's different than you are, and somehow or other what you are is the foundation or the center of what everything needs to be, and inclusion simply means that somebody's being excluded. So how do you break those barriers down? And I do think a lot of this primarily comes to a white population's willingness to allow their mind to be open, allow their mind to be criticized, to listen, which is certainly being encouraged through this meeting or otherwise, but listen to what's being said as opposed to immediately putting up a barrier of, oh my gosh, let me tell you all the reasons why I'm not that. And so that's probably where, different than you, Mark, of growing up in an environment where it may have been obvious. I've always felt I was that, grew up in that perfect environment where nothing was ever an issue. And how could this ever be? And we may be the worst from that perspective, that we think we don't have these biases or otherwise. And I think as Lij just said, everybody's got them no matter what, but the willingness to admit that, the willingness to acknowledge that on a race perspective, because the white race in our country in particular has systematically always been the center of which everything else works off of. I think realizing that and starting from there and being open to make the change, I think is the only way we're going to make the change in our society as a whole. So I don't know if it answers anything. It probably makes things more confusing.
Well, it's a nice segue, and I'm jumping around on our questions list here, but a little bit. But you know, for me at this point in my life, I still like to think of myself as fairly enlightened and thoughtful on, you know, issues of race. And inevitably, you know, on a very regular basis, some friend of mine pulls me aside and says, "Hey, man, you really missed the boat on that one. There was some nuance you didn't catch, or that was a microaggression, or you really made an assumption that was inappropriate." And so, you know, and James, maybe we can start with you on this one. You know, what kind of advice would you give to people like me that go on about thinking that they're doing something the right way or trying to help, and it turns out that maybe they missed the boat a little bit? How do you get back on the horse and start riding again?
James can probably have personal examples and use me as all the times I missed the boat on everything.
Those Tim, are still covered by privilege. Pardon the pun. So Mark, I think your question's a good one, and it takes me back to your how to be an ally outline, and there are a number of those resonate with me, but I think in particular in response to the question you've just posed, there are a couple that stand out. One is, well, it's subsumed under be an advocate, but it really is the matter of accountability. And the other is be flawed and do the work anyway. And as to the first point, I think it's important to hold oneself accountable and to hold others accountable. You know, you mentioned a moment ago that you hear from friends, acquaintances, people whom you trust and who care about you and who know that you're open to having some of these hard conversations, and they share with you things that you may have said or have done or conveyed that didn't land in the way they knew that you would have wanted based on whom they know you to be. I think it's great that you've got that. I think it's good that you've got in your life people who hold you accountable in that sense. And I would say that you as someone in a position of privilege, and we've talked about this some already, but you as someone in a position of privilege and someone who has significant influence behind closed doors in places and spaces where out-group individuals are not represented, I think likewise ought to hold peers, colleagues, and others accountable for the things they say, the things they do, sometimes the things they don't say. So there's that. And then, you know, I think there's an important concept of grace and understanding that that none of us is going to get it right all the time. I think each of us has to try to do better. You know, there's the saying, know better, do better. I think that's good guidance. When you fall short, I think the steps to take are to acknowledge that. I think if you have hurt or offended or damaged someone, harmed someone in some way, to the fullest extent of your ability, I think you should make that right. And then otherwise, I think it's important to continue to do the good work, the hard work of being an advocate, an ally, and working to create a more, I'm not so sure about the concept of a more perfect union in these days and times, but certainly a better society and more equitable opportunity for all.
Kimberly, has there been an example of a time where, an ally really either made a difference in something that you were going through, or a time that you wished you would have had an ally that could have been helpful?
Sure. Well, I kind of mentioned a few instances of where an ally really made a difference, particularly in the area of sponsorship early on, and that included championing me and making room for me to receive high profile or good work at the law firm, and then also making room for different committees, again, different speaking engagements, publications. And so I've been a benefactor of a lot of those opportunities. I do want to touch on a time where I wish I had an ally, and that is going back to your outline. I thought out of the list here, the one that was probably most foreign to me was to be a confidant. And the idea of, well, let me back up and say, being an African-American, male or female, at a large law firm is a very lonely place to be in. And even being in-house can be a very lonely place to be in. And so the idea of having someone to vent to, or not even to vent to, but just to share your frustrations or some of your experiences and what your needs are, what your fears are, is still very foreign to me. And I think it's a shared experience with a lot of attorneys that I know who are coming through the ranks. And so to have someone, I look back at instances where I may have chosen a different path if I had that confidant or someone to say, this is a frustration that I'm really having. And unfortunately, being in the position of not wanting power and trying to figure out how things work, it was basically too late in some ways for me. I had made a decision to go a different way with my career. And after I made that decision, all of these allies came up and said, oh, but you're great, you're this, you're that, you have such a future here. And so again, I for me, the idea of being a confidant is something that I think, again, is a shared experience and something that is an area where I wish that I had an ally that I could feel comfortable and trust enough to talk to about some of the frustrations as they were happening in real time.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing that. And to the audience, by the way, we're going to have some time for Q&A here in just a little bit. So if you do have questions or things you'd like the panel to address, go ahead and get those in. And here in a few minutes, we'll jump to some of those. But before we do, this is an issue where progress is slow if left to its own devices. And we may be able to encourage certain individuals to act as leaders and to engage in these types of intentional activities to become an ally. But are there programs that any of you on the panel have seen in organizations, whether they're law firms or private companies, where there is an intentional program to almost push these types of ideas and understanding down into an organization? I know, James, you and I were talking the other day about, in my experience, I've certainly seen those people that when we talk about diversity programming and hiring minorities, they kind of sit in the back of the conference room and say, I'm only doing this because I have to, not because I really get it. I think my comment to you was, well, I suppose that's a form of progress, because it at least starts to push the agenda. It's not the end goal, obviously, but what are the things that we should be doing in organizations to intentionally create more opportunities for allyship and more understanding for people in the in-groups, especially to be proactive in finding people to sponsor and to mentor?
You know, Mark, I'll address a couple of elements of the question you just posed. You know, as to the diversity imperative, I understand that there are any number of folks who don't buy into it, who don't embrace it, who are not fans of it. I like to think that as progress is made and as I would say younger lawyers come into law firms and into the legal profession, but I think that would be unfair. I know any number of folks who are seasoned and young, as I would characterize myself, you and Tim to be, who get it and can get it. I think there are a couple of things. I mentioned earlier the idea of culture. I think a firm can cultivate a culture where diversity, equity, and inclusion are embraced, are prioritized, and are valued as values, principles, and objectives unto themselves. And I think that goes. I think that comes from the message that's sent by firm leadership. And you know, firms have myriad ways of incentivizing attorneys to do those things that the firms want them to do. You know, billing clients, building a book of business, moving into a particular market, and so forth. And firms have been very successfl at coming up with incentive structures to drive behavior. So that's one thing I would note. I would also say, and you and I have chatted about this, and I've not discussed this with Kimberly and Alvin, but I have discussed it with many other general counsel and internal counsel. You know, diversity, equity, and inclusion are important factors and metrics for many clients who are paying the bills and who are making the decision about what firm or firms to engage based on a whole range of factors and considerations, among them often diversity, with an understanding that not only is one not getting a diluted product because of a diversity focus, but rather one often gets a better, stronger, more thoughtful, more creative product and output with a diverse team. So I think that those folks to whom you refer, who sit at the back of the room and who don't really get it and who don't really embrace it, I think should reconsider their position and perspective based on any number of things. As for programs, you know, actual programs of sponsorship and allyship that work, formal programs, I don't doubt that they are out there, but I suspect there are others on this panel, indeed perhaps someone from an organization that specializes in those very programs who would have much more current, insightful thoughts on that particular question. And so I cede the floor.
Amy, do we have any questions from the group?
Yes, hold on. So we have to you and Tim, any advice based on your successes and failures in this respect as to how to be an effective ally to someone who is an underrepresented group? I guess it's the how-to manual.
You know, for me, it's been, there has to be a lot of introspection and really thinking about why you feel the way that you feel about different topics. And for me, you know, there were a few experiences in my life as an adult that really made me start to question, you know, what I thought before that day. One of them was reading the book, The Accommodation by Jim Schutz. And since we're in Dallas, or at least DFW, I think it should be required reading for everyone. I had been doing a lot of work in public education reform and really just did not understand the deadlock between white Dallas and black Dallas when it came to trying to figure out how to fix public schools. And reading that book in my backyard one afternoon, it was like a light bulb went on and I went, holy cow, like this isn't some ancient history problem that we're dealing with. These people, I know them and they live through these experiences that are just unimaginable to me. The other thing is, especially through social media, we see a lot of, back and forth. Everyone wants to state their opinion. Nobody wants to really listen to the other perspective. And I think the watershed moment for me, as I had mentioned to you, James, the other day was when Michael Brown was killed. I noticed that several of my African-American friends, made comments about how it brought tears to their eyes. And, as a white male, I did not understand that perspective. And it didn't make sense to me. And I think I probably had what, a more typical white response that would have been. And so, I didn't fight with them about it. Instead, what I did was I called them both up and said, all right, I saw that you made these comments. I have a lot of respect for you guys. Can you tell me why you feel this way? And those conversations, which happened over the following, 4 or 5 days, gave me some insight into, how they felt about the world, which was very different than the way that I had ever perceived it. And I think that really changed my perspective. So I think you've got to be open to, when there is disagreement, instead of jumping to some preconceived conclusion, sitting down and asking, why do you feel this way, and just listening. And again, I mentioned earlier, asking myself, who am I associating with? Who am I working with? You really, it is important to really run that drill on a very regular basis. And, to the point of being a proactive sponsor or mentor, when I have that conversation with myself and I conclude, I've got a bunch of white male associates that I'm giving all my work to, or these are the people that I'm doing political work with, that's the point at which I go out and trying to identify someone else that is not in that group and try and include them. But it's something that, quite honestly, doesn't come natural. As we said, we all have our implicit biases, and we have an attraction to affinity groups like us. And so I've got to constantly remind myself that this is important, and then go out and actually do something about it, because it's not going to happen on its own. So Tim, I don't know if you have a different experience.
Mark, I think you're exactly right. I think from a senior leadership position and our age group and otherwise, I think the thing that's most important is that no one else is going to solve this for us or for the individual, the understanding of it intellectually and practically. And so going back to my whole concept of investing, I mean, you have to invest in yourself to solve this problem, to understand what the issues are and dig down. You can't expect your Black friends to give you the 101, here's the answer, here's how you're going to solve this. You have to read, you have to understand, you have to be open-minded. You can certainly ask questions, but nobody else is going to solve this for you. You have to do it yourself. Other point that I would add to you is people like you, like me, that are in leadership roles within our organizations. You have certain agendas that you can push forward, certain things that are important to you that you can make happen. And that laundry list cannot go on forever. And to the extent someone like me is in a role of being a managing partner and says part of my platform will be during my tenure is that we are going to achieve, we are going to work to achieve this goal. These are going to be important. And we've been fortunate that the leadership within our firm is very focused on that. Our long-term strategic plan focuses on that as well. We've not nearly been as successful as we've wanted to be. We've been benefited by clients who have held our feet to the fire, as James pointed out earlier, that while it is difficult and while we'll hear our directors of diversity and inclusion say they're going to pull their hair out if they have to answer another one of these surveys that are sent out or compliance reports that are sent out, at the same time, both holding our feet to the fire and then rewarding that behavior once I think becomes an important way that our clients help us achieve that. But from a leadership perspective, if you say this is going to be important, it has to be something that you constantly are pegging yourself against. How are we doing? How are we doing? How are we doing? And it's a measurement that if you've set it as a priority, it has to be something that you measure. And when you fail, say, you know what? We failed, as opposed to, oh, well, let's sweep it under the carpet, or we'll portray it a different way so that we look more successful or whatever. I think you have to own up to the failures as well. And then just, again, going back to the whole point of what are we doing to build the organization to be a better organization than was transitioned to us. It just becomes an important part of it. But as a leader, you have to set that priority, and then you have to live that example.
Mark, I'd like to add something to the comments made, and that is the thought that we are comforted by our uniformity, but we only ever learn from diversity of thought. So Mark, when you talked about how the perceptions of a police shooting, how it was different from what you felt versus your Black friends, you know, the idea of, I hate approaching these conversations from idea of shame or guilt, and it's really much more powerful when we approach these conversations from a position of power. You know, I often say the one color everyone sees is green. And today, 51% of 1-year-olds in this country are multicultural. The rapidly shifting demographics in our country, the diversity of thought, the news streams, revenue opportunities are all today. The business case around diversity and inclusion is irrefutable. So, and then you know, we often talk about a VUCA world: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And my gosh, has that been even more pronounced in a COVID world? We are stronger when we have provided allyship, sponsorship, gotten to know and created safe spaces for perspectives that are different from ourselves. So I just want to add that at the end of the day, this is really about enlightened self-interest. So yes, there's a deeply human case to this. Yes, allyship is powerful and means so much to people of color, women, underrepresented talent. But there's also part of this, especially from the perspective of the sponsor, that is about enlightened self-interest and really the future legacy, and very much from a business perspective of the firm and the organization.
We just have a few minutes left here. Amy, we have one more question.
Yeah, Rudy's got us a good question here. Our whole discussion has really been talking about an ally that's at a higher level. Can we we'll start with Tim. Can you talk a little bit about how you can be an ally and it's associate to associate level, or someone that's on the same power level?
And we may have to stop with Tim too, because we only have 5 minutes left. So go ahead, Tim.
Are you suggesting that I'm not concise with my comments? I'll try to be much more concise here. I think there are. I think you have a sphere of influence in every. I can only speak from a law firm perspective, but every circle that you're in, whether it's your peer class that has joined the firm at the same time, whether it's your peer practice area, whether it's your same office, or otherwise, you have cohorts that you have the ability to influence. And I think you absolutely can be and learn that, I think, from the start. And frankly, I think anybody that you see that ultimately accedes to a leadership role has done that throughout their career.
And thank you, Tim. And I want to just make a couple closing remarks since we're really getting to the end. Hopefully, Rudy, that answered your question. I thought it was pretty good, Tim. So, but as homework, as we all walk away from this thing, there's 2 things that I think we can all do just internally, and these are rhetorical questions, but so answer them in your own mind. But next time you have an event at your house, or think of the last time you had an event at your house when we were allowed to actually do that back in the old days. Think about the people that were at that social gathering of your close inner circle and what those people look like. And did they look like you, or was it a diverse group? Um, and when we're allowed to get together in 2021 again, maybe be a little bit more intentional in your guest list so that you can start to expand your horizons, because a lot of these issues around race and allyship, they start with empathy, which only comes from really understanding another person, which only comes from actually spending time and getting to know another person's thoughts and their plight. So, be intentional about who you're socializing with and what that diversity group looks like as well. The second piece of homework is, think about, what am I doing to be an ally right now? And if the answer is nothing, then I hope that you'll take a few minutes, just like you plan any other part of your life, and come up with some form of game plan to figure out what you might do to be an ally and to be proactive about identifying people that you can sponsor or mentor to be part of the solution, and not passively sit by and observe the problem. And with that, I'd like to thank our panelists. So thank you all for taking the time to join and talk about this very important issue. Susan, I don't know if you have any final remarks to the group before we go.
I think it's Alvin.
Oh, Alvin is making the final remarks. My apologies. Alvin, go right ahead.
No problem. I think you covered it all, Mark. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our sponsors. I failed to mention the Texas Law Book as someone who we should particularly thank for their involvement in getting this message out. As Mark said, we have a lot of homework to do. This is just the start of the conversation, but we need to continue to think through the things that we can do to become better allies. Thank you all for attending.